Well, thanks for popping by. Got a bit of a different video today, so I'm going to try doing something a little bit fun. So another thing that I absolutely love, along with planning, is true crime. So love to read about true crime and listen to podcasts and things like that. So I thought what I'd do is I've got this true crime kit, so I'm going to use this. This is from Fantasy Design Stores. So I thought I'd use this this week. But what I've also done is I've also kind of researched a true crime story. So as I'm planning, I'm going to talk to you about a relatively local, certainly within a fairly local area to where I am, true crime story. So it's a story going back to the early 20th century. So it's not a current one, it's an older one, but it's quite interesting. As you'll see while we go along why I picked this one, it does have some kind of elements of kind of witchcraft and lore and legend with it as well, around to do with the local area, so hence why that one was particularly interesting. So let me just bring you in slightly. I think we were, sorry, that was a bit fast. There we go. Okay, so trigger warnings to start with. It does talk about murder. It does talk about quite gruesome bits and pieces in places, about post-mortem kind of results and things like that, and it does talk about kind of witchcraft and occult and things like that. So if it's a couple of things that you don't like, then skip this video, but we'll get on. So I've decided to do the rest of this video as a voiceover. Just it was a little bit too confusing trying to put down the stickers and concentrate on that and tell the story. So this is a standard vertical kit. So as you'll see at the start, the date covers don't fit perfectly, and at the time I was trying to actually kind of talk through the story. So yeah, they're a little bit messed up, but bear with me, I do find a workaround. So okay, so on to the story. So let me take you back to 1945. The date is the 14th of February, which is Valentine's Day. The location, Lower Quinton. Specifically the first farm, which is on the slopes of Meon Hill in Warwickshire, to the site of a gruesome, unsolved, still to this day unsolved murder of Charles Wharton. So let's just talk a little bit about Charles. So Charles was born on the 12th of May 1870, making him 75 when he was killed. Charles had lived in Lower Quinton all of his life and shared a cottage with his niece Edith Wharton, who was 33 years old. Charles had adopted Edith when she was 3, on the death of her mother. Edith lived with Charles despite her father still being alive and living in Stratford. Couldn't actually find any information as to why Edith was adopted by Charles and didn't live with her father, so it's an interesting little bit of information. Charles was a widower. He'd lost his wife in 1927 and had lived in the cottage since World War I. Charles worked when he could as an agricultural worker, and he'd always been described as a loner, and he didn't socialise with his neighbours. Charles and Edith very much kept themselves to themselves, but also were not known to be in any way disliked in their local area by their neighbours. Charles suffered with rheumatic joints and walked with a stick. However, this didn't stop him working regularly wherever he could. For the previous 9 months before his untimely death, Charles had been working at the first farm for a local farmer called Alfred Potter. On this day, February 14, 1945, Charles left the cottage to go to work just as normal. He had with him his pitchfork and a bill hook, which is a double-edged pruning device with a sharp and straight edge on one side, which were the tools he would take with him to do his job. Witnesses reported, yes, they reported seeing Charles pass through the local churchyard between 9 a.m. and 9:30 a.m, as he would do normally on any average day. His work that day took him to the field known as Hillground, which was on the slopes of Meon Hill. Edith worked as a printer's assembler and was at work that day. She would ordinarily get home each day at 6 p.m, and Charles would get home at 4 p.m. So when Edith arrived home that day to find Charles not there, she became immediately concerned, as Charles was particularly known for his regular behaviour and solitary ways. Edith immediately called on a neighbour, another farm worker called Harry Beasley. They then made their way together to the first farm to let Albert Potter know that Charles had not returned home that day. Albert Potter confirmed that he'd seen Charles earlier in the day slashing at the hedges as planned in Hill Ground. So all three of them set off to the spot where Charles had been working. Unfortunately, they would come across what they had dreaded and found a body near a hedgerow. The body was obviously of Charles, and Charles was found to have been beaten over the head with his own stick. This was found near his body and was covered in his hair and blood. His throat had been cut open with his slash hook, with his bill hook, and his pitchfork had been driven into him, pinning him to the ground, with one prong through his throat and the other two either side of his neck in the ground. It was also stated in the local area that he had had a cross etched into his chest. As they found their body, and while Harry Beasley was trying to pacify a distraught Edith, another man, Harry Peachley, walked along the other side of the hedge. Alfred Potter called to Peachy and asked him to go and call the police. A statement was later taken from Alfred Potter later that night, and he stated that he had been at the farm for 5 years and had known Charles all that time. He'd casually employed Charles from time to time during the last 9 months and stated that Charles had worked hard for him when the weather permitted. Charles had been concentrating on cutting the hedges for a few months, and Hill Ground was actually the last field that needed doing. The local Warwickshire Constabulary brought in assistance from the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard during the very early stages of the investigation, as this was not the kind of crime that they were used to dealing with. Alfred Potter quickly became a suspect, along with a number of prisoners of war who were held at Lungmarston prison camp nearby. Apparently they were allowed out of the prison and allowed to roam around the hills, around Meon Hill, so obviously they were all listed as suspects. However, Alfred was soon ruled out by the investigation, as they could not find any physical evidence to tie Potter to the murder. However, many people still to this day believe that he was responsible, as there was a rumour about the village about Walton owing him money relating to another local business that Potter ran. But there's no evidence again that can be corroborated to prove whether that was or wasn't the case. A post-mortem that was performed on Charles found that his trachea had been cut and that he had bruising to his chest, along with a number of broken ribs. Charles also had defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, which indicated that he had tried to fight off his attacker. It was concluded that Charles was killed by 2 weapons, a stabbing weapon and a cutting weapon, presumably his own pitchfork and bill hook. The local Warwickshire Constabulary brought in assistance from the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, as previously mentioned, and the main detective was a detective called Fabian, and he later became quite famous, and he wrote some books, and he was known as Fabian of the Yard. And there's a lot of information about Fabian out there, as he was really renowned, kind of really up there, kind of detective. So Charles had also been severely beaten by his own stick. The coroner determined that Charles must have died between 1 and 2 p.m. His shirt had been opened, his trousers unfastened, and his flies were unbuttoned, presumably in an act of kind of trying to humiliate him. However, the post-mortem made no note of the cross that had been reportedly carved into Charles' chest, so this at this point was just speculation. So, there are many strange tales associated with Meon Hill. It rises up above the hamlet of Upper Quinton,
and the flat Avon Plain. Rippling at its foundations are an ancient ridge and furrow fields, and atop is an ancient Iron Age fort. Meon Hill is 637 feet high, and it's often swirled by clouds, looking quite mystical. And for those travelling from Stratford, it stands as a moody gatekeeper to the Cotswolds beyond its southern side. Legend has it that it was created by the devil himself, who, on seeing the construction of Evesham Abbey from Leamington Hill, in a fit of annoyance kicked a huge clod of earth at it, to bury the abbey. However, Saint Equine saw it incoming and prayed, and it fell to the ground and became Meon Hill. So, as you can see, Meon Hill itself kind of started with that legend. There are many strange tales associated with Meon Hill. It rises above the hamlet of Upper Quinton, as I've mentioned before. So, picking on these beliefs and strange ways of people of rural Warwickshire, the police investigating the murder began researching possible links between Walton's murder and the occult. The officer involved, as previously mentioned, Fabian, started by reading folklore, old customs and superstitions in Shakespeare land, written by a local clergy called J. Harvey Bloom, which was written in 1929. Two tales in the book are of particular interest in the case at hand and became very rumoured around the whole of the case. The first is the story of a savage murder that bears certain similar hallmarks to Charles Walton's. 13 miles over Meon Hill, in the southernmost tip of Warwickshire, Anne Tennant, 79, was living a peaceful life in the Cotswold village of Luncompton. Until, that is, she was murdered by James Hayward using, you guessed it, a pitchfork. A report in the Stratford Herald describes the horrendous event, quoting, "On the night in question, between 7 and 8 o'clock, the poor old woman left her cottage for the purpose of going to a small shop in the village for a loaf of bread. On her return, she met Hayward, who had just left his work in the harvest fields, and who, without a word on either side, attacked Mrs. Tennant with a fork, which he was carrying, inflicting such injuries upon her head and body that she died in the course of 3 hours. In fact, had it not been for the assistance of Mr. John Taylor, a farmer who resided near where the attack took place, he would have killed her on the spot. The only reason that can be assigned for the murder is that Hayward, for some time past, had been under the impression that he was influenced by witchcraft, and that Mrs. Tennant and several other women in the Luncompton area were witches, and he was determined to rid the village of them." In his book of 1906, Clive Holland, in his account of the Tennant murder, explains that using a pitchfork in killing a witch was a relic of the old Anglo-Saxon staking or sticking. It was believed to be the only effective way to kill a witch and neutralise any curses or spells. Holland points to the eerie confession given by murderer Hayward. "I pinned her to the ground with a hay fork before slashing her throat with a billhook in the form of a cross." Although the courts found Hayward insane and locked him away for life, he was not on his own with these strange beliefs. Reporting on the case, the Illustrated Police News observed, "It was proved in evidence that fully 1/3 of the villagers believed in witchcraft." The account of the Tennant murder that Fabian had read in folklore, old customs and superstitions in Shakespeare's land also included a reference to a ploughboy who, in 1885, met a black dog on his way home from work. 9 times he met the strange dog, a creature which represents evil in Warwickshire folklore. On the 9th day, it appeared as a headless woman, and on the following day he learned of the death of his sister. And what was the young lad's name? None other than Charles Walton. And the locations of the sinister sightings were on Meon Hill. However, it has since been postulated that this was not the Charles Walton of our story, but just some coincidental ploughboy of the same name. But who knows? It wasn't just rural folk who experienced unfathomable encounters. Shortly after Charles's death, Fabian himself, the fearless man of Scotland Yard, reported seeing the same black ghost dog. And a few days later, locals found a black dog dead, hanged from the branch of a bush by its collar, close to where Charles's body had been found. This time of the year, it was noted, was the Roman feast of Lupercalia, when dogs were sacrificed to ensure good crops. So usually people want to help the police, especially if a victim is vulnerable. But local people, in fact, avoided participation in this murder investigation, and they seem unbothered that a man was potentially on the loose. Fabian commented that when he tried to interview local people, there were lowered eyes, reluctance to speak, except for talk of bad crops and a heifer that died in a ditch. Perplexed, Fabian noted, but what had that to do with Charles Walton? Nobody would say. So could Charles Walton's inclination to dabble in witchcraft have led to his untimely end? Locals certainly seemed to think of him as eccentric. His spotting of the black dog that preluded his alleged sister's death was given as evidence of his special witch-like powers. During a search of his residence after the murder, there were a number of natterjack toads found kept in his garden. Creatures allegedly used to blight crops since the 16th century, according to the Annals of British Witchcraft. One local lad, perhaps keen to muscle in on the murder drama, reported he had seen Walton harness a toad to a miniature plough, which was a means of cursing the earth that it touched. 15 years after his death, talk of Charles as a witch or warlock was revisited with the apparent strange discovery of his pocket watch. Police had searched for it extensively at the time of his murder, even using metal detectors around the crime scene. It was said never to have been out of Walton's possession, and thus they believed it may have been handled by the murderer themselves and would yield telltale fingerprints. According to various unsubstantiated reports, however, on the internet, the watch was found in August 1960. Although many have reported the story, its original source seems lost. The gist is this. While demolition work was being carried out on the outhouse behind Walton's old cottage, a workman spotted a metallic glint. There was the watch, and inside the old tin watch was a piece of darkly coloured glass, also known as witch or scrying glass. It was used in the art of divination. Whether this happened like it is told, or is just another questionable element in the tale of Walton's witchery, it's hard to fathom. Looking back today, where does all this leave us? Fabian was reluctant to offer any black or white answers, but 25 years after the murder, he issued a grave warning while working on his book, Anatomy of a Crime. I advise anybody who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax of a pagan rite. There's no stronger argument for keeping as far away as possible from the villains with their swords, incense, and mumbo jumbo. It's prudent on which your future peace of mind and even your life could depend. So although the inhabitants of modern Upper Quinton are mindful of the rich heritage and interesting beliefs of their predecessors, they are less worried now about dark forces than commercial ones, which are currently threatening their community. So in more recent history, the current owner of the land where Walton was murdered, where his blood seeped copiously into the soil, is seeking to sell part of the tranquil spot so houses can be built there. If developers won't take notice of the local residents vehemently fighting the planning permissions, perhaps they would do well to heed Fabian's warning and not mess with this curious and special place. So there we go. So what do you think? What is your opinion of the murder? Do you think he was killed as some kind of ritual? Or do we think it was Alfred Potter and that the rumours, unsubstantiated rumours of Walton owing him some money were actually to be believed and that's why he killed him? who knows? Unfortunately, it's one of those stories that we'll probably never have an answer to. A lot of the people that were involved with it obviously will have passed by now. So yeah, so let me know what you think. Do you know the area? It's not too far away from where we are actually. And after kind of researching this, myself and hubby have decided we might take a trip down to the Cotswolds, Bourton on the Water, and just pop past Meon Hill on the way back and have a look, because it sounds like it'd be quite a cool and mystic area. So that would be kind of exciting. And if we do that, I'll let you all know. So just finishing up with the plan with me, I'm just adding in a few more bits of the deco here from the kit. The kit, I don't know if I mentioned at the start, I can't remember, it's from Fantasy Design Store. It's one I've been hoarding for quite a while, but I thought it would be perfect to go with this story and to have a go. I have full on added that deco, but I just loved every single one of these boxes. So I wanted to make sure they were there. And there we go, a nice empty sheet, which is also always really satisfying. So I'm just adding in a few bits on my tracker, things I want to track. So tracking my medication for this week and tracking that I'm tracking, which yeah, always I'll put in my cousin, so that I'll make sure that I'm looking in my B6 and filling in my trackers. So just having a look at see if there's any more deco there, any more icons there that will fit for the week. So just looking through. Let's see. I think that was pretty much it. I don't think we've got much left. So just adding in a couple of little bits of the icons, just the computer screens, just to indicate kind of work times. And there was a couple of those, so it was nice to be able to add them on both halves of the two sides of the pages. And I did add one in there for payday as well, and one for Happy Mail. So yeah, so I've used scripts from my Blinko and from Little Blue Papery in this spread. And we go, just adding in a few more little bits of deco because there's so much in there. What I'll do is as well, I'll probably add in some deco as it goes along, and I'll put an Instagram spread up of how it ends up when it's all filled in. See how the week looks. So you can follow me over on Instagram. Again, Cheery Raven Page, you can find me. So that's what's left of that page, and that's what's left of the deco that I can add in for the rest of the week. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think with regards to true crime. And yeah, thanks for popping by. Take care.